there's so much demand, there's so much pressure to get things out the door quickly seems to supersede doing it securely.
Today on TechNado, we're talking with Security Weekly's Jeff Mann. We're going to hear all about his day job and learn from 30 years experience in the IT industry. It's all coming up on TechNado, starting right now. Hello and welcome to TechNado. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, joined here by Don Pizzette in Don Pizzette's office. Don, how you doing?
Hey, I am, I'm in my office where it's exceptionally hot because of all the lights, but it's also hot because we got a great interview lined up.
Yeah, we got new lights. It's pretty exciting. We look good, don't we? This is someone that we actually talked to, I guess not on the podcast, but we talked to last year when we were out at Wild West Hackin' Fest. It was you and Daniel at the time, and so this is someone we've got some history with.
Oh, yeah. I originally met Jeff Mann at Paul Security Weekly, right? I've been out there to their studios a couple of times, and he's a regular host over there. Great guy, just a font of knowledge. He's been involved in IT security for a long, long time. So he brings a pretty neat perspective versus a lot of the people that are out speaking about all this rapid change. He kind of sees all the trends from a much larger view, which I always value. But we run into him at conferences. Wild West Hackin' Fest is a great example of that. He's just a great guy all around to talk to. So it's a neat chance to kind of catch up with him and see how things have changed over the last year.
Yeah, and I brought up his LinkedIn page, and he just keeps scrolling and scrolling for all the cool experience, and every one you're like, oh wow, and ask him about that and ask him about that. So we do get to ask him about a lot of those things. So let's go ahead and take a look at that interview that's coming up right after this on TechNado.
I'm James Packer. I'm the General Manager of Kirk ISS based in the Cayman Islands. I used IT Pro TV extensively in my last place. It grew very well, helped upskill the team. I had 110 engineers in the field and we had dozens of IT Pro accounts with the guys training, and last year alone they passed over 40 certs by using the online training. I think I can safely say without IT Pro TV I wouldn't be where I was today because I only got this job on the back of the qualifications I have.
All right, welcome back to TechNado, and as promised, we are now here with Jeff Mann. Jeff, how you doing today?
Doing very well, thank you.
And we were talking a little bit earlier. We saw you just about a year ago, or Don did, I guess, out in Deadwood at Wild West Hackin' Fest, and back then we got a chance to kind of ask you, predictions about the next year that was coming up. And I don't know, what do you think? Did you get most of those right? Do you remember what you said? Yeah.
I have no idea what I said.
Well, I will say they were all right. We went back and checked, and every single thing was right. But how's the last year been for you? And what have you been up to?
Well, it's been an interesting year for me. After my foray into vendor land, being a subject matter expert, and sort of bouncing between self-employment and underemployment for about a year and a half, decided, what I really miss more than anything is being customer facing and trying to help companies out with their security issues. And so I called my old boss, who I used to work with 5 years ago before I was teased away to go work for Tenable. And he was no longer at the same company where we used to work, but he'd set up shop at a company that I'd never heard of. I don't think he'd ever heard of, but it's a company called Online Business Systems. It's based out of Winnipeg, and they let him basically start a commercial consulting practice, risk security and compliance type of operation. So I said, hey, I want to get back in consulting. Do you have any openings? He's like, funny you should ask. We're actually landing a big contract within the next couple weeks, and they're in your backyard. So the planets all aligned. And I went back into the consulting world, and I'm happy to be customer facing again, and I'm back to doing teaching and educating about what security is all about, primarily from a PCI perspective. Although in the council's infinite wisdom, I am no longer qualified to be a QSA, even though I've got 35 years of experience and was a QSA for almost 10 years. They now require certifications to be a QSA, and I sort of, as a matter of principle, coming from where I've come, from in my past don't ever want to get a CISSP, and so far it's working out. So I'm a junior QSA, associate QSA they call it, and intend to be that until somebody insists that I do something differently.
Well, maybe you'll get to be a QSA when you grow up.
Maybe.
But I always think that when you hear like a junior, that's anyhow, unfortunate someone with
You'll make it someday. Yeah.
Your vast field of experience. Now, let's talk about that experience, because last time we talked, you obviously have a pretty heavy background in PCI compliance and areas like that. But the big talk of 2018 has been GDPR. So how have you been dealing with that? Has that been a lot of relearning for you, or is it all still rotating really around that world of PCI compliance?
Well, for me personally, I'm still doing mostly PCI consulting advisory work. GDPR, newsflash, there's nothing really new about security. I've been in the business for 35 years, and because somebody put out a compliance standard that says you need to protect a certain type of data, doesn't really change the fundamental principles of how do you do data security. Now, it may have been ignored, and in my opinion, it has been largely ignored in the private sector anyway, for the better part of ever. But that doesn't mean the fundamental principles aren't still there. In fact, a talk that I've been giving off and on for the last year or two talks about sort of the things that I learned in my background, and I started in the DoD many, many years ago, back in the early 80s, and the way that security was done, mostly before computers were very commonplace, when it really was data security, and it was mostly printed matter and locking things in safes and having layers of protection, meaning locked doors in offices and protected buildings and security fences around the building and such. I've been reflecting and realized, there's a lot of lessons that I learned from the DoD world in terms of data security and data protection that in the beginning of what we used to call internet security, and now we call that other thing. I'll try to avoid saying it. You guys can use the C word, but I won't. But from the very beginning, a lot of people that were experts in security came out of the DoD or came out of the government, and while we knew how to do security, it never translated well into the commercial world. There was too much, and I experienced this often as a consultant. There was too much, I don't need to understand security. Just tell me what blinky box I need to buy and how many and where to put it and what color is the light supposed to be. And frankly, in the early days, it was, you're going to be on the internet, you need a firewall. And then shortly after that is, if you're going to have a network running behind the firewall, you need to know what all your vulnerabilities are. So you need to run a scan engine. Oh, and by the way, people might break through the firewall, so you need to have intrusion detection and you need to have monitoring, and it's gone on and on and on and on. So if I was a commercial company in this world today, I might be a little bit fatigued at how many quote unquote solutions are out there. And if you've walked the floor at Black Hat or RSA, I don't know how anybody makes heads or tails of it. So in my reclining years, as it were, I'm trying to go back and say, hey, maybe there's a few lessons that we never quite learned from DoD security. Maybe let's focus on that for a little while and pay some, at least talk about it and discuss it, because I don't see a million other products coming out there, a million other solutions to solve a million other problems. That doesn't seem to be working, because it's barely a day or a week goes by before some other major breach has been announced from companies very often that a lot of us in the industry say, wow, even them? I thought that they knew better. I thought they were doing things right, type of thing. There's certainly exceptions to all of that, but that's kind of a high level of where my head's been at the last year or so.
Well, I'll certainly agree with you in that GDPR doesn't really push anything new, but there are some boundaries that it sets that are pretty aggressive. And the one that I get the most questions about is the 3-day breach disclosure policy. Right. I think it would be a rare company prior to GDPR that would disclose within just 3 days. They'd want to do their full research and evaluation and get all of their forensics done before they actually disclose. So how are you finding, are companies having to just rebuild their disclosure process altogether? Or are companies just violating that and saying we'll deal with it when that happens, or what's the uptake you're seeing?
There's frame of reference is PCI, and PCI also has a requirement for notification. Don't quote me off the top of my head. I want to say it's 7 days, but or maybe it's 30 days. But whatever it is, the reality is most companies that have gone through a breach of credit card data, usually it's the card brands or the payment processors coming to them saying, Houston, we have a problem, and it's you. So it's always been kind of funny to me that companies are on the hook for breach disclosure, and they're supposed to disclose it to the card brands when the card brands more often than not are the ones telling them about it. Now that differs slightly with GDPR, but in terms of planning perspective, disaster recovery, all that type of planning that goes into it. For the companies that I've been exposed to and discussions I've had with other industry professionals, I would say it's more the category of people aren't doing a lot yet because they're kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, when breaches start to occur that are GDPR related, and what are the lawsuits going to look like, and what's the case law going to, come down to in terms of amounts of fines and the severity of the fines and stuff like that. So, from what I've been seeing, and I will concede that it hasn't been a lot of focus for me in the last couple months anyway, but from discussions that I have had with people, it's much more of a wait and see. So I don't think companies are doing a whole lot to plan ahead, other than maybe change the 30 days to 3 days or whatever it is in their procedure document.
Now, you mentioned that OBS is based out of Winnipeg, and
Yep.
It got me kind of thinking. We hear about GDPR so much because of the EU. It's a huge collection of countries. Here in the U.S., we have our various things like PCI compliant. Well, PCI is global.
HIPAA, maybe.
HIPAA's U.S.
industry specific.
But now that you're working for a Canadian company, I assume it's possible that you would be leveraged.
Winnipeg is in Canada. You're right.
It's been confirmed.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. There's not like a boot in the name. So, but for you, as somebody who's been doing consulting at least inside of the U.S. all this time, how do you ramp up for handling something in another country like that? How do you discover what the regulations are? It seems like it'd be a lot of learning all at once.
Well, fortunately, the work that I'm doing right now is mostly with U.S.-based companies, and a lot of my experience overseas, and people in Security Weekly like to tease me because I mentioned going to Canada a year or so ago as being overseas, where technically I did cross I was going to Nova Scotia, and I did cross a body of water, so I stand by my statement. But to include Canada, the UK, Germany to some degree, the most of the business that I've done internationally has been U.S.-owned companies that are also doing business in those foreign countries. Although I have had a couple customers that are foreign-based doing business in the U.S. The big differences are in terms of, obviously GDPR is the big one right now. Knowing what the rules are, and this is true in the U.S. as well, because it varies from state to state. You need to know what the local laws are that govern the company, where they're headquartered, where they're doing business. Most of the companies that I'm dealing with are larger, and they have internal groups, whether it's their general counsel or whether it's their internal audit group, or they might have a GRC, governance, risk, and compliance group. They usually are pretty good about doing it on their own and being aware. So usually it's me asking, hey, do you know what the laws are in all the countries you do business with? Yes, and here it is to demonstrate. GDPR has certainly got a lot of attraction this year because it's new. And as I said, I think a lot of companies are just kind of waiting to see what happens. The couple things that happened in the last, I've been traveling so much, it's hard to keep track. Was it Facebook or Google where people in the last month or so were like, aha, I wonder how this is going to impact GDPR. But I still think it's a wait and see type of effort. That's been my personal experience. Even though my company is based in Canada, I'm doing a lot of work in the U.S. still. My current customer is U.S. based, and we're focused on PCI right now. GDPR is sort of a nice to have, but despite what people say about PCI being a bare minimum compliance standard, you'd be surprised how hard it is to actually follow it if you're trying to do it right. So.
We're talking with Jeff Mann of Online Business Systems, and Jeff, I want to switch gears a little bit. You mentioned you were at Wild West Hackin' Fest. That's where we saw you originally about a year ago, but you were there again this year, and you did a talk called "What Are We Doing Here?" So, did you mean specifically what are we doing here in the middle of the Dakotas, or what was that talk about?
Well, it was sort of purposely open-ended, and what I was trying to set up was a discussion about Wild West Hacking Fest. Great conference. It went really well the second year. You guys missed you. We were back at the cigar shop again. But they moved the conference down into town, so it was all downtown. We didn't have to go, traipsing a mile or two up the hill to the lodge where it was last year. But what I was trying to do is I go to a lot of conferences. I hear a lot of people talking, especially in the hacker conferences. Everybody's talking about vulnerability this, vulnerability that, threat this, threat that. We're in the security business and so on and so forth. And it's sort of a spinoff of the talk I was talking about earlier about DoD level security. When I learned security, I learned something called the risk equation. And at its most fundamental level, I try to simplify things. Risk is a function of vulnerabilities, threats, and the way I learned it was countermeasures, but I would submit to you that you can substitute security for countermeasures. And what I was trying to introduce is just to get people thinking and to get people talking is our industry, the security industry, seems to be 90% focused on vulnerabilities, whether you're pen testers finding them, scanning services, vulnerability management, all the different product companies that are out there. Certainly there's lots of talks at conferences about, I just discovered another O-Day, which is based on this vulnerability or that vulnerability. My supposition is, if you look at the risk equation, vulnerability is one variable, but security is another variable. So maybe all the things that we talk about vulnerabilities, like configuring systems, changing default settings, writing secure code, maybe that's not security at all. Maybe that's just your job. If you're a system administrator, secure your box. If you're the desktop administrator, secure your desktops. Security is obviously a function, but it's a part of your daily job, whereas security, according to the risk equation, is something else. And I spent a little time talking about that from a focus of vulnerability, and then a little bit on threat, because threat's a nice buzzword that likes to be bounced around, especially at the big vendor conferences. But sort of the same thing. If we identify threats, if we acknowledge that threats are people or bad guys or enemies or nation states or people out to try to make money off you, and there are people that are doing certain things, and what we often call threats in the industry, I would simply call attacks. But not to get hung up on the language, again, if that's a separate variable, if that's a separate element of an equation, then what is security? What else is there? So my question, what are we doing here, is we all call ourselves security professionals, but how many of us are actually doing something that's not directly vulnerability or threat related, and it's that something else? First, what is that something else? What else is there? And what are the things that we do? Not to say anything's right or wrong, but just try to I get frustrated when I hear all these terms bandied about at endless conferences and trade shows, and when you ask people, what does that mean that you're just talking about? They're like, I don't know. So I just, I'm trying to up everybody's game by, let's define our terms, let's agree on what the terms mean, let's agree on what things are and aren't. Maybe it turns out we don't have this huge labor shortage in security. Maybe we just need a whole lot more developers that are taught how to write secure code. And while that's security related, that's not security. Security is something else.
Well, let's build on that by stacking some industry buzzwords on it. You mentioned the developers.
It's time for buzzword bingo.
There we go. So get your bingo card out. Developers. About 2-3 years ago, a huge driver started for not just the software development lifecycle, but the secure software development lifecycle, and actually people doing secure coding practices, which made a lot of sense. But then this whole DevOps movement started, and you've got developers who even the developers who have been trained to write secure code are now deploying infrastructure as well, using things like where they'll do Docker environments locally based on a Docker image, and they then deploy into production with it. And what I'm finding, and I'm not sure, I'd be curious to see if you've been finding the same thing, is that by taking some of the old sysops roles and pushing that onto developers who haven't really been trained for that, they're making simple mistakes. They're making mistakes on an underlying layer where their software might be secure that they're writing, but the underlying OS isn't, or the way that container is secured. Are you finding that's a problem for organizations?
Yes. Next question. Or do you want me to embellish?
Yeah. Well, what are you seeing?
Well, you're touching on a lot of things, in your one example. And these are observations that I've made in the last couple of years going to too many conferences and trade shows. One is, flipping what I was just talking about around. There's a lot of people that have jobs that are important to this thing we call security, and within an organization in particular, that very often don't talk to themselves, don't talk to each other. They're silos. I see this very much when I do PCI compliance assessments, because part of that process is interviewing all the people that are responsible for all the different things that you're supposed to do for PCI. And so when we're talking about endpoints and desktops, we talk to the desktop people. When we talk to configurations of servers, and suspend for a minute the whole Docker and going to the cloud. That's let's table that for a minute. But if I talk to the server administrators, and we talk to them about their boxes, that's fine. If I ask them, well, what's running on these servers? They're like, well, I don't know. I just keep the operating system running. But even like talking to DBAs to understand the databases that store the sensitive data that they're trying to protect, that have built the databases and the schemas and the tables and where all the data is supposed to go, and you start asking them, well, what's the purpose or function of all this stuff? They're like, I don't know. I just, they tell me to build a field that's this wide and this tall, and that's what I do. So there's a lot of silos, a lot of lack of communication, and what that leads to is there's a lot of assumptions that somebody else has got this covered. And that goes again back to the beginnings of this thing we call internet security, where all these networks were functioning and we didn't have to worry about security, but all of a sudden we plug into the internet. Well, the firewall guy, they'll cover that. We'll have some security people that build a secure perimeter, and they'll take care of security so that we don't have to think about it, or don't have to talk about it, or don't have to do anything. But repeat that in 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different places. To use your example of software development, what's wrong with software developers knowing how to write secure code? A. What's wrong with software developers being asked to understand a little bit more the boxes that they're going to be running the applications on, the building blocks, the tools that they're using, the infrastructure? I can argue both sides. Yeah, it makes sense that they understand that. That's going to make them a better coder, but that used to be somebody else's job in somebody else's silo, and they have no experience in that. So you're highlighting an example of the fallout of these silos. There's people that know how to do this that they know how to do, and they assume that other things are being taken care of and everybody else is the same thing. Extend that to the cloud. Go to the cloud, put your, in the early days, it was your websites, your e-commerce systems. Put them in the cloud, it'll be cheaper. You don't have to maintain the boxes. Put your infrastructure in the cloud, it'll be cheaper. You don't have to spend money on all that hardware. Read the small print. You're still responsible for security. You're still responsible for, doing all the things that you have to do. That automatically isn't flipped over to the cloud provider. But if you want us to do that, that's fine. You'll just have to pay for it. And then slowly people start to realize, organizations, it's not as cheap as what I initially thought it was going to be. There's a lot of add-on when you start factoring in all the things that really have to be there. It's like going to a car lot and you want to buy a new car and you get a great deal on it, and then the dealer says, "Oh, you wanted to have doors on the car? You want to have an engine under the hood? Oh, well, that's going to cost you." Maybe that's a little bit extreme, but hopefully that gives you the idea.
Yep, and I do have a buzzword quota I've got to hit, so let me try and ramp this up a little bit. So the one that I've been seeing a lot is thanks to methodologies like Agile, where companies are trying to put out changes as quickly as they can, and they're doing continuous integration, continuous deployment, so CI/CD. You can bring in a whole team of physical pen testers. They can run a full gamut of testing over a period of a week or two or whatever, and find all sorts of vulnerabilities. But if your code changes every single week,
Right.
it's near impossible for these companies to stay on top of that and ensure security across the life cycle of their software, across the entire course of a month, better yet, a year, a decade. So, what are you seeing companies do to try and ensure security even after a test has been done, like if everything's changing?
Well, you're mentioning, quite a few of the things that they do, and I'm a curmudgeon, and I don't like the sea changes that are happening, but it's certainly hard to apply a traditional engineering software development model to today's world, where there's so much emphasis on getting code out quickly and making all these changes on the fly. So, what I consider to be sort of fundamental concepts I'll say a generation ago, a mere 5 or 10 years ago, where you do everything in development, and then you have procedures where you test it all, and then once everything passes, you promote it into production after you've scrubbed everything. That's sort of what is prescribed in most SDLCs. Oh, and SDLCs say that you think about security right from the very beginning, and
that always happens.
It goes every step of the way in the design phase, and in the development phase, and in the implementation phase, and so forth. I don't know how anybody does it other than you throw up your hands and you do what I think is the least efficient thing to do. But if they're making money on it, I guess who can argue? But to test for vulnerabilities, to hire pen testers and application pen testers, and whatever automated tools you can get on your own, or you hire somebody to run the automated tools for you, it's still an after the fact thing. And that, as a security professional, bugs me that you're doing it backwards. But the concession seems to be, but there's so much demand, there's so much pressure to get things out the door quickly seems to supersede doing it securely. So, one of the big arguments that I have with Keith Hoodlet, discussions, I wouldn't say it's an argument. He's passionate that there's no such thing as DevSecOps, that security is actually built into DevOps, and he wants me to go out and buy a book, but I refuse to buy a book and become an expert on it. But I recently worked at a company that could be construed as a software development company. I won't say who it was, but you can figure it out. And I asked for the 3 years that I was there, where's a copy of our SDLC? Because I was working with a lot of developers trying to fine-tune our products for PCI. Never saw one. I'm pretty sure it didn't exist. But they had their methods and they had their ways, and they did a lot of the steps that you would expect in a software development company. But it wasn't written down, as far as I could tell, what the procedures were. There was a lot of knowledge that was built into the organizations that were responsible for it. And in the time that I was there, and since then, and again, I'm not trying to point fingers, but just using it as an example, they had some significant issues with some version releases here and there, where they, some more embarrassing than others, and it was all handled. But if that's the way everybody wants to do it, who am I to argue? Let's do after the fact. I guess one other thing to mention, which seems to be, in the early days we used to call it just beta testing, but now we call it bug bounties. So that seems to be a popular thing. And I've had lengthy discussions. I forget who we were interviewing on Security Weekly, but I finally came to the realization, Bug Bunny is just sort of like outsourced pen testing or open source pen testing. Okay, now it all starts to begin to make sense. Again, there's nuanced differences. I understand all that, but essentially, again, you're putting your code out there and letting somebody else try to find the bugs. And and paying a bounty for many companies, that's more cost effective, or it probably more realistically is just more pragmatic. It's the way that they have to do it, because there are so many pressures to get things out the door, to get the new features added, to be nimble and agile, and stay ahead of the game.
If you had bug bounty on your bingo card too, that's the last square.
Scratch
Congratulations! All we missed there to really make Don angry was AI and machine learning.
Yeah,
so
that would have been
hopefully Don will get to those topics in a second here. I did want to ask you. You mentioned how much you love change, and I noticed on your bio you're one of the hosts on Security Weekly, and I was looking at your bio on that page, and it mentions that you were on the first penetration testing team, the red team at the NSA, and I'm guessing you probably can't tell us any cool stories about that, but I'm curious just to see your take on how pen testing has evolved since that time, because I guess you kind of helped come up with the procedure originally for that.
Well, I actually do talk about it, and I'll try to condense it a little bit and give highlights. I did a talk that basically told the story of the beginnings of the Red Team at NSA a couple months ago at a conference called GERCON up in Michigan. And the title of the talk is called More Tales from the Cryptanalysts, because 2 years ago I did a talk about my earlier days at NSA, which was a lot of crypto stuff, and I called that Tales from the Cryptanalysts. But when I was putting that talk together, I actually had some fun with it, and I'm going to give you guys a pop quiz in a minute. But I was trying to go back and figure out, well, gee, what did we have and what didn't we have? Because every time I hear people talking about pen testing these days, it's, well, you got to have Kali Linux, and you got to have Metasploit, and you got to have Meterpreter, and you got to have this, and you got to have that, and run all that, and you'll pop boxes. And I keep thinking, man, when we started, we didn't have any of that stuff. And so I was like going back and trying to remember, what did we have and what didn't we have? So as an example, I left, all of this beginnings of pen testing was in the early 90s, 92, 93-ish range. And I left NSA in 96. Nmap was not published until 1997. So we didn't even have Nmap when we were doing our thing, being the first red team at NSA. What we did have was source code, and this was prior to Linux, so we had Unix source code. We had knowledge of how Unix worked and features of Unix, because a lot of the early exploitation we did was just taking advantage of default settings and configurations and what have to be called features of the operating system that you either knew about it, and it was all tricks to get a root shell or elevate your privileges to root. So here's the pop quiz. When we were doing scanning of networks to try to do port scanning, we used to use a tool called Strobe. If you guys ever heard of Strobe, it's okay to say no.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm going to let Don take these, because I'm here. I'm the pretty face, obviously. Don's here for the brains. Strobe, Don.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one.
No? All right.
Well, Strobe was an open source tool that was used to do primarily TCP port scanning in the days before Nmap. There was a couple other tools, but that was a very popular one. And I was looking at it, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember Strobe. I hadn't thought about it in probably 20 years. And because Nmap came along, and Nmap was so much better. But I was looking at when was the original release date of Strobe, and I noticed who the author of Strobe was. And somebody reminded me, because I was telling them this story actually back in Deadwood, when you launched Strobe, you got a little screen pop up, and this was not GUI, this was in a shell, and it said Strobe, copyright whatever year it was, written by, and then it was the name of the author. So here's my pop quiz for you, and if you don't remember Strobe, you're not going to get the answer, but the author of Strobe was
I'm going to go with Pete Sampras.
Oh, yeah.
World-class tennis player and security researcher.
Yeah, I think it was Agassi.
All right. So the author of Strobe was none other than Julian Assange.
Whoa.
Really?
And when I saw that, I
was like 12.
Yeah.
That's why I always knew I knew his name, because he's been in the news a little bit lately, and I always knew I knew his name, but I didn't know why. And it wasn't until I was looking up who wrote Strobe. I'm like, that's why I know the name Julian Assange. So in an earlier life, he was a hacker for good and put out tools that were used for network analysis, let's say. But anyway, so that's one story. I'm actually thinking about putting together a talk that just talks about the early days of pen testing in general. We didn't have methodologies, we didn't have SANS courses, and I've had many conversations with Ed Scotus to answer your question about how pen testing has evolved. I actually don't think it has evolved much, or not as much as I think it should. In fact, my foray back into the hacker community, which has just been in the last couple years, started with me going to DerbyCon and Ed Scotus giving a keynote entitled "How to Give the World's Best Pen Tests." And I thought, well, gee, I used to do pen testing. It'll be cool to see how things have evolved. And Ed knows this story. I've talked to him personally about it, so I'm not trolling him much in telling you this story. But I was kind of disappointed in his talk because he never actually defined what a pen test was. He never talked about goals of a pen test or what the scope of a pen test was. He kind of talked about, in the best of all possible worlds, you've got time and resources, and you get lots of juicy findings, and you just get to run amok and do all sorts of cool stuff. And I was sitting in the crowd thinking, my idea of a perfect pen test is you fail. And my first talk that I gave, which has been a few years ago now, again, since I sort of got back into the hacker community, was, do we still need pen testing? And my contention is, and it still is to this day, with very few exceptions, if you're doing a pen test to discover vulnerabilities, you're not really needing a pen test. There's other ways that you can discover vulnerabilities. It's not cost effective. A pen test, more often than not these days, should be when you're ready for it, when you have the maturity as an organization. You want to have a live fire test. You want to test your defenses. You want to test your detection capabilities. You want to test your response capabilities, whether they're automated or manual. That to me is the ideal pen test, is you're ready for it. And the idea of doing vulnerability discovery and finding misconfigurations and default passwords. And I've had many conversations with many, very elite, respected pen testers that, I ask them, well, how do you usually break in? And it's, there's a top 5 that usually has something to do with default settings, default passwords, trust settings, things like that. And I'm like, wouldn't you love to do more? Would you love to do different? And they all say, yeah, we would love to get beyond that. So I don't think pen testing has evolved or not, but we've gotten into this rut as an industry as using pen testing, and for that matter, vulnerability scanning tools to discover what's wrong with your network, rather than do all the things that you need to do in terms of processes and procedures and educating your developers and your admins to doing the security things that they should be doing as part of their job anyway. And then pen testing and vulnerability scanning is much more of a safety net and a trial by fire, a live fire test. That's my idealistic view of the world, and I realize that's not the way it works most of the time. But you asked.
Yeah, it's tough to say if you have a pen test where you fail to get in. Does that mean that you have a great network or a terrible pen tester? It's really, I think it's tough to tell.
So that's like the 800-pound gorilla of pen testing. Even if you do break in, you're never, and most pen testers, it's in their SLA or their T's and C's. They're not guaranteeing that they found all the problems. So you can pass or fail a pen test, and it doesn't really mean anything because you could be popped tomorrow by something that they didn't look at, didn't encounter. Some new vulnerability or O-Day comes out. But what they do often do, which is good, is find the low-hanging fruit. Unfortunately, it's stuff that you should have known about or should have prevented already, like all the default settings and default passwords and things like that. But there's pen testers that still, make a good living off of discovering that for their customers. But the really good pen testers that have really good customers, they've moved on, and it's much more of a cat and mouse game where they're challenged by, okay, they're ready for us. Our customers know all our tricks. We've got to find something new. We've got to come up with something new. And sometimes they get in and sometimes they don't. But those are very mature organizations, and I think they're the 1%, and and there's 99% of companies out there that need security first, can't afford that caliber of a pen test, and really there's more cost-effective ways of doing security, I believe, than starting with the pen test. So I'll never be invited to another hacker conference again. But that's my opinion.
Yeah. Hey, well, Jeff, so our viewers, our listeners know they can see you every week as one of the hosts on Security Weekly, but if they want to learn more about online business systems, where can they go to do that?
So our website is obsglobal.com, and our practice is called RSP, Risk, Security, and Privacy. So if you go to the website, there's some kind of drop down that says RSP, or Risk, Security, and Privacy. That's our practice. We have consultants that have most of us have been doing this for 20 years or more. So it's a pretty senior set of consultants. We have a pen testing team that I think does a pretty decent job. They're not as well known as some of the companies we're familiar with, but that's okay. I don't think pen testing companies necessarily need to be well known. And we've also recently, because we're trying to reach more of those 99% of companies, we're venturing into managed security services as an offering, more of like, I think on lines of monitoring and detection and response, as well as a little bit of virtual CISO. But we're trying to, we have the expertise, and we're trying to get it to as many companies as possible in as cost-effective way as possible.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time with us today, and I hope it doesn't take a year for us to talk to you again, maybe at one of the conferences that we're both at, or something between now and then.
Yeah, definitely. A year's too long, and I missed you guys in Vegas this past summer. So hopefully we'll connect somewhere soon.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for taking the time, and stay tuned on the Technado. We'll be right back after this.
My name is Dana Morrison. I'm the IT director at Grace Christian School in Raleigh, North Carolina. IT directors often hoard so much knowledge that it's hard for their team members to learn. IT Pro TV has given us the ability to level up our technicians to a point where they can decide, this is important for me to learn. I would recommend IT Pro TV to any IT team. It's just a great tool for any IT professional.
All right, welcome back to Technado, and that was a great interview with Jeff, and I feel like it's one of those that if we didn't have a constraint of how much memory we had on our disk drives here, we could have talked for 4 or 5 hours. That was a lot of cool stuff.
I'm already thinking of questions I wish I'd asked, like, when he started working for a Canadian company, how long did it take him to learn to speak Canadian?
Sure.
Like, was that hard to make that adjustment?
Yeah, the language barrier's got to be tough, and the mayo on the fries, and the poutine, all the things. I mean, ketchup chips.
There's so much about Canada that you have to learn on the fly.
I have no idea what you just said, but no, that was a cool one, and I think hopefully we can find a way to get Jeff on here a few more times. It sounds like we might cross paths at a few conferences coming up in 2019, so hopefully we'll be able to hear a little bit more and talk in a little more detail about some of those things that we talked about on the broad level today, and hopefully we'll be able to complete our buzzword bingo cards. We were close.
Yeah, I really think we need to manufacture those. Somebody probably already has that,
Yeah.
but or a drinking game or something. It could revolutionize the way we do interviews.
By the end of it, if it's an interview like that, it will be stumbling over our words by then. But thank you so much to Jeff for joining us there. But we want to let you know about a few things before you go. First of all, we've got some webinars coming up. Definitely head over to itpro.tv/webinars. You can see all the ones coming up that you can sign up for, as well as all of the archived webinars that we have on there. So you can go back and watch any of them on demand and learn all about whatever it is we were talking about that you missed. And we'll definitely have some great new topics coming up to sign up for as well. Also, want to let you know about a special offer from IT Pro TV. We're doing a 30% off promo for anyone watching or listening to the Technado. To go to go.itpro.tv/Technado. You can get that coupon code. We've also got a 7-day free trial when you sign up for an individual premium or standard monthly membership. So head on over there and check us out. Can't hurt. No obligation. Cancel anytime. All the buzzwords.
Operators are standing by. Offer expires while you wait.
Yeah, I'm going to do a marketing card there as well, and that'll be the backside of it. So act now. Hurry. offer supplies last. While supplies last, get on that. So, Don, anything else before we go today?
But wait, there's more. No, that's all we've got for this week. I do want to remind you all to reach out to us on social media if you have any questions, suggestions. If you know anybody who would make a great interview for IT Pro TV, for TechNado, for any of the various commercial medias that we create, we always love to hear from you, the public. That helps us to basically figure out what content to throw on the show. It's always a lot of fun to interview people, so we're always looking for new interview victims, subjects, whatever.
Yeah, on all of our commercial media.
That's right. It's our commercial media empire.
I think
right?
that's a word. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this commercial media today, and we'll see you right back here on TechNado next week. Thanks.
Are you enjoying TechNado? Then be sure to check out our other podcast, Ask Me Anything, where our subject matter experts answer your questions. Here's the latest episode, and here's the full playlist. And as always, be sure to subscribe to IT Pro TV's channel. IT Pro TV!